Welcome to Porch Play Chat, sponsored by the American Association for Promoting the Child's Right to Play, or more affectionately named IPA-USA. IPA-USA is the USA affiliate of the International Play Association, which is comprised of 23 different countries, all focused on promoting the child's right to play. As part of the USA's efforts, we'd like to introduce to you our Porch Play Chats. And these are conversations with individuals on a wide range of topics who are just as passionate about play as we are. You can find the latest Porch Play Chats by visiting our website at IPAUSA.org. And then in that upper top right-hand corner is our Facebook and YouTube channel and Instagram links. And if you click on the Facebook page and friend us on Facebook, or click on the YouTube channel and subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll have a Porch Play Chat in your inbox every Monday morning, because we release one a week year round. So I'm Deb Lawrence, and I'm the president of IPA USA. And with me on the porch today is Aaron Goldblatt. Aaron is an architectural and experience. He operates an architectural and experience design firm that's based in Philadelphia that focuses their practice on learning environments built around play. I mean, what better, how awesome, right? And they work in schools, museums, gardens, healthcare settings, and anywhere people gather to learn and be together. Aaron, we are so excited to have you. And so I think your question is really, how does one play change, right, over the ages? And so I'm really interesting, like what from when we used to play with sticks or play with mud, and what have we kept and what have we let go? So that I'm really curious to hear play across the lifespan, because I play all the time across, and I've been playing for a long time. So welcome.
Well, it's really lovely to be here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. And when you asked to, like, so what's a question that you're thinking about these days? And that actually had been on my mind for some ways, self-serving purposes. I don't have an answer to it. And I do believe that I would be surprised if there wasn't a library of dissertations out there that directly or indirectly focus on it, you know, from human development folks to, you know, the whole gamut of people who are students of play, which I count myself in, although in a rather dilettante way. And it's kind of self-serving or self-absorbed in some ways, because as I, you know, close in on 70 and I think about what do I do differently now? What do I do that's the same? And I think, you know, I've devoted much of the last 35 years to play in focus specifically on kids and families, often in museum settings. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's just, I like I say, I don't really have an answer to it, but it is something that is of real interest to me. My practice.
When I think, you know, when I think about my transformation, so I'm like you. Mom said, go outside and play. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. I tell the story all the time. And, you know, when it was interesting when some politicians say, oh, we have to go back to where mothers stay at home and they're not out of the workplace. And I just start laughing, because my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She said, it's time to go out and play. I went out at, goodbye. I went out at 8 o'clock in the morning, and around 11, she would put a lunch sack filled with my lunch on the back porch step, and I would go take my lunch and go underneath one of the trees, and I would eat my lunch. And if I was thirsty, I went and got the garden hose and I drank the water out of the garden hose, and I played. And then about, you know, maybe 2:30, a snack would appear and I'd go eat my snack, and then I'd go play some more. And then, you know, around 5, she'd say, okay, it's time to come in and take a bath and get ready for the evening. I never saw my mom. I was outside playing. And so I think about how that experience really, I had a childhood injury when I was little. So I almost died when I was 5. So it over that period of time, I had to relearn to walk and I had to do all this stuff. But when I went, so I skipped kindergarten. And when I went to school for the first time in first grade, my parents had never read a book to me. The book, I don't think I ever had a children's book, but I will say that I walked in there not knowing what a letter was, what a number was. And I was reading proficiently at a first grade level in 3 months. And I am not, you know, a genius child, but I was ready, right? And I had all these rich play experiences that gave me the opportunity to develop the skills I needed and the risk that I needed to be able to learn to read. So what was your experience like?
So I grew up until I was 10 on Army bases.
Mhm.
And my dad was a lifer in the Army, and we were all feral children. And the same way. And, generally moms would give a sandwich to whoever showed up for lunch. And she didn't really care who that was. But then, and my mom was among that community. The military life is a beast of its own. It's a really interesting, it's kind of like a small town in Iowa that's heavily armed and, and incredibly international. But then my father died when I was 10, and my mother went to work, and she went to work, and we kind of had to figure it out, all of us. And we got sedentary. We stayed in one place. We hadn't been moving around every 6 months, 2 years. So it was a fairly rude awakening into a different American life. And I've always, and I had the question that I came up with at your prompting was, that I have watched my own children, now my grandchildren's play and my friends, and how that changes over the years, and what stays constant, what doesn't. And it's really, again, I don't have a particular answer to the question, although I think that it's obviously in here, that they're and in here, body wise, that I have a grandson who's 10 and very much a person of the mind, and he's not terribly physically active, a little bit, but like when his mother forces him, like, no, we're now doing something physical, we're getting on our bikes and we're riding for 2 hours or whatever. But his default mode would be books and maps and drawing, and which I think, that's wonderful. But I know now, and having watched him from the day he was born until a couple of weeks ago, he's gonna live the rest of his life in that manner. His sister is, I won't say opposite, but very, very different. She's 5, all body focused. I mean, she just hurls herself at the world with this astonishing boldness and fearlessness. And I suspect she's going to go to her grave, hopefully 100 years from now, in exactly the same way, even if it's from a pair of crutches or a wheelchair. This sort of emotional and intellectual way of facing the world. And so I somewhere in there is I think the beginnings of a theory, such as it is.
So what I hear, though, between the two grandchildren, and I have 8, which I feel very fortunate to have, and they go from a year all the way to 12. What I hear, though, is that we really have to look at this from what developmentally appropriate practice tells us. It's individual. There are some milestones that are typical that we need to consider, but every child's development is individual. And that it's within their own cultural context. Like my children were raised in a military, we traveled all over. My first husband was in the Air Force, and we traveled all over the world. And so but they have always played. They played with we were in Bremerhaven, Germany, was one of our stations for 3 years. And they had a group of children in the, housing that was in the middle of Bremerhaven, military housing in the middle of Bremerhaven, where they played and played and played. And when we moved to Colorado, they found the neighborhood kids and they played and played and played. And so, but I think what I'm hearing you say is that, especially between your grandson and your granddaughter, it is their own individual style that is setting sort of the stage for what play may look like for them as they continue to move toward adulthood. And those are sort of rooted in their interests. And so you might have a child that is not as physically active, but is still playful in working with maps and reading books and doing drawings. And so we have to recognize that not all play is going to be physical, right? So I think that's an important aha moment for people, that you have to give children the opportunities to follow their interests, and you follow their lead, and every child's going to be different in
the phenomenon that libraries are beginning to develop. I presume you're familiar with Megan Tolarowski. And she did this really wonderful project with a competing and friendly competition for us, a really wonderful architecture practice here in Philly called Digsaw, that in a bunch of the branches of the Philadelphia Free Library System. I know that's not unique to Philadelphia, where they're thinking, particularly in the children's libraries or children's sections of libraries, understanding that children play in lots of ways. And one of the wonderful things about those opportunities is that they are also, it's a very broad gamut of how children can play, that includes things like books. It includes things like quiet, solitary spaces. That the problem with a lot of American society, and we're probably not alone, but the notion that a playground equals play. And that's and I confess I'm not a huge fan of traditional equipment-filled playgrounds, and that that's what play constitutes play, and it's so reductive as to be cruel. That's not true. And and at the same time, the library's waking up to, well, many kids do need to run around and climb things and bonk each other on the head, and libraries can support that too. So that's I think that's a relatively new phenomenon that doesn't have to be the rule. And it's a much broader spectrum of opportunity.
Well, and I think that the thing that we have to focus on is that we have to help people understand that what your definition or perception of what play looks like isn't necessarily right for every child. I mean, some children like that stagnant, solitary playground equipment, but when I take my grandchildren to the park and they have a piece of playground equipment, they're typically not on it for more than 10 or 15 minutes. And then they go running around in the grass and they go, we have bubbles and we have balls and they're doing all sorts of other stuff. And so if we can, I think part of that sort of idea of what play, if you have a piece of equipment in a park, then that's your play. You can check that off the list, is maybe where we need to tackle city governments and local areas and parks and rec, and saying it's not always the best way to support play. And it's one way.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable one way.
Absolutely. But there are so many other ways, and can we explore some other ways as well, so that you have some options and choices versus, going up and down the slide or down and up the slide as a way of playing. And so I do think that is maybe part of our problem when we walk into local parks who have, at least there's a local park, and at least they're attempting to put in some equipment, but maybe it's getting to the leaders in those local areas to say, here's some other options where you don't have to have the surfacing at a certain thickness, and you don't have to replace it every 3 years, and you don't have to, but it allows children to have more creativity and an ability to initiate their own play and not be sort of relegated to a play structure. Is that where we need to go?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I have no argument with that at all. I think it's great. There is a kind of fundamental issue that has to do with how we raise children, and that in what we think of childhood more broadly. And the fact is, relegating children to incarcerating them in playgrounds is an act of distrust, of a pretty profound distrust, and that the notion of trusting the kids will figure out the classic spectrum between a standard, perfectly well-designed, overly safe playground and an adventure playground, which is almost non-existent in the United States. There are a couple, and I laud them. They make me incredibly happy. But where the equipment, so to speak, big air quotes, isn't telling the kid what to do and how to do it. The kid has to accept and assess her or his own risk capability, capacity, her or his own physical comfort, whether or not she might like a match so she can start a fire. Whether that all of a sudden this universe opens up, but it is built on respect of that individual child, not on litigation mitigation, which I think is a profound excuse, not nowhere near the reality that our policymakers would have us believe.
I agree with you. And, we just did a Porch Play Chat that'll be in this series with a Sacramento adventure playground in California. And I mean, and how they've helped the community. It's in an at-risk community with families who were untrusting of what might happen on an adventure playground with saws and nails and hammers and fire.
Yeah,
And
those rich white kids up, in the next neighborhood, the city is spending bajillions of dollars on, this beautiful equipment, and you're giving us pallets? Are you kidding me?
cardboard boxes. And it's amazing the amount of time it has taken for the community to feel comfortable. And they have a parent area, right? Parents can't go in, but they can occasionally go and check, if they need to. But yes. And I think about the one in New York where there's a fence that parents can see through, but they can't say anything. But I think because we're in this fear conscious, overly protective sort of period of
Which is
of
narcissism.
yes,
It's
of
flat
human
out
existence,
narcissism.
absolutely. We have to kind of provide incremental baby steps to help people recognize. And I think part of that can go back to play memories, right? So you and I shared play memories, right? But we're losing that because I teach community college students, and in community college you have a diverse range of folks, and it's fabulous. But I'm currently teaching a group of students who are just out of high school, and their play memories are not rich. And so we're losing the ability for folks to have those play memories that help them understand the importance of play. And so I think if we can get to the people who still have those rich play memories, we may be able to make systemic change on what is the definition of play. And it's not always a static piece of equipment. And how can we go back to ensuring children have access to risky play, not hazardous play, risky play, because that is part of human development. And if they don't learn it when they're little, how to self-regulate their bodies and how to make decisions about, ooh, that may be too high, I need to find my way back down, then they're not going to have those skills when they get older, when the risks or hazards become much more
Yeah, we break our hips.
consequential. Yeah, 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 yeah.
It's funny, we do a lot of work in pediatric settings, and there is a spectrum of risk tolerance in what we can design for their patient population, but it all ends up toward the risk averse end of that spectrum. And I totally get it. There are places where it's all, they've devoted their lives to risk poorly taken,
Right,
by
exactly.
kids, by parents, by whatever, communities that refuse to vaccinate, the whole 9 yards. And as exactly as you say, that what are we teaching kids about what constitutes risk, and how, and what is your authority as the player in assessing and executing to your edge of risk. And that's I'm not that smart, and I certainly am not that, I'm no scholar, but one of the ways that I think about play as a defining characteristic is that it's testing what you know against what you don't know.
Yes.
And that, for the athlete, it's, testing her or his own body against, the mile run, the whatever, the marathon, the game. For a gardener, it's from, her kitchen table chair in February thinking about, ooh, what would be really cool this next growing season? And I've never tried that. whatever that happens to be. And I don't know what if my soil conditions are helpful for that melon, whatever.
Mhm.
I don't know if my plot's big enough for that grain. I've never tried grains. And there's this risk assessment that's going on at all levels, looking up at El Capitan or, beer pong, for crying out loud.
Well, and risk, you have to be able to take risks to learn to read. So if I haven't had any opportunities to take a risk in my early years, then taking a risk is going to be too scary for me and might impact my ability to learn to read proficiently. So, I mean, we have to look at how these short-term decisions that we make have long-term impacts. And so I think you and I and other play advocates can recognize what all of the issues are, but I believe it's how do we get other folks, how do we share that, and how do we get other folks to understand? I always go back to Bruce Perry, the child psychiatrist and neuroscientist who talks about the learning cycle, right? And in all of his work with children who've been neglected or traumatized, he said this is really what has to take place. And if children, and the very first step is to be curious. And if children are too afraid to even be curious, then the learning cycle just can't take place. And so if we can,
yeah,
it is, you've already, compromised their ability to reach the potential they were gifted at conception. So I think if we approach it if we can go and talk to leaders and do presentations around why being risk averse isn't going to help you reach the outcomes you're hoping for every child, it might be a starting point, because people are always looking for what are the long-term outcomes, right? Well, I can tell you, if you don't do this, then here's a long-term outcome. And if we don't make spaces available to children where they can take acceptable risks, and in some cases, fall down or have a cut, or, that's part of life.
Well, and there are other kinds of risks too that are, we have I think, particularly in the United States society, a kind of aversion to spectra. It's really hard for us to understand things that don't land in a particular place on any given spectrum of possibilities. And oh shit, where was I going with that?
Spectrum of possibility.
I think about it's easy to convince a policymaker of the romance of play, and that it's sweet, rosy, kind of slightly foggy glasses of what play means. But the problem is it is always a spectrum, and bullying is a part of what happens in children's play. And that doesn't make it good, bad, or indifferent. It just makes it, a geologic element of social play, particularly among children and adults, for that matter. And we've all met bullying adults too, and that it's, unless we're willing to talk about the full complexity of really anything, but in this case, play, we're going to dig ourselves into a hole that's really hard to get extracted from. So if it's, the sweetness of a playground, sure, get some really beautiful compound equipment, call it a day. If it's more about, no, let's acknowledge the complexity of it, and that some elements really need to be at full universal design, so that a kid who's deeply compromised physically has access to that, has she has the right to play too, for crying out loud. And
Absolutely.
but then exposing her to the bullying of kids who are not compromised in the same way, that will happen in a playground that is the full spectrum of play. And okay, maybe she will learn something from it. And the best case scenario is maybe that jerk bully will learn something from it.
That's exactly right. Because, we're always going to face them, right? They're everywhere. And if we don't learn, we always, instead of, you don't put a child in timeout if they've made a poor decision, you talk about it, right? And you think through it and you say, well, what else what could we try next time instead of making that poor choice? And then unless we have that conflict resolution cycle where children are learning alternative ways to handle things themselves instead of the adult
who just tell them
the consequence, again, we're impacting development and their ability to be successful. So I agree with you. If you're going to have, it's never going to be all happy, right? Never. It's never going to be that. But it has the potential to allow children opportunities to figure out ways to approach situations. And like right now, children don't even know how to make friends. They want to stay by their parents on the playgrounds. Fortunately, my grandchildren are like, oh, and they're out making friends all the time with kids. And I see parents of those children kind of watching really carefully to make sure, because again, we're so protective, which, is one of the 3 prime directives of the brain, to protect the young. But I really think we have taken it way too far. We need to certainly protect them, but we don't need to be so risk averse, which is where I think we've sort of headed. So I think that's another huge issue. But what an issue that play and getting folks to understand what the essence of play is, and that it's not just the perception of static equipment on a playground, could help to ameliorate some of these other issues that we're finding as the children who haven't had those experiences grow up.
Yeah. Well, one question, and I don't know how much more time we have, but the one of the questions I have that flow from the question you asked me to come up with has to do with, okay, so how do you assess, what is the difference in our assessment of risks as we age? And we talked briefly about one aspect of it, of literally, I remember talking with my mom before she died of, she was getting older, and literally stepping off the curb was a slightly frightening experience for her. And okay, fair enough. But what can we do to allow them to at least figuratively step off the curb routinely?
Well, and how do we design spaces that allow that to happen? So back to my community college students. So we have like sitting walls around our 3 levels of green space, right? And so when I take my students out for play, because we play a lot in the early childhood program, when I take my students out to play, 6 years ago would sit on the wall and then move and then get onto that space. Now, 25 years ago, I would have jumped off the wall, right? Oh no. And now
I would have to do it by crawling.
Now I walk around all the walls to the flat green space and come in. But again, I think that's because we've learned to manage risk when we were younger, which has steadfastly stayed with us as we've gotten older, right? So I really think it's that long-term benefits of being able to climb to the tree as tall as you wanted to climb. And I had con trees, so I was able to go really high. But know when I was too high for me that day, and to be able to back my way back down. I think that those learning connections that I made in risk assessment are still with me today, knowing, okay, you can't do that anymore. Try.
Right. It's this sort of
Yes.
elevator passing in the night of like, God, I can take more and more and more. Oh, geez, I got to take less and less and less.
Yes. But I really think those learning connections stay with us. But if children don't have the opportunity to make those learning connections, then later in life, they might have more adult injuries because they don't have that internal gauge of risk assessment.
Well, I mean, the adventure playground example is a perfect one, that the incidence per capita of use of injuries that take place in an adventure playground is far less than what happens in a conventional playground design, where it's telling you what to do. Oh, there's padded surface. I could do a face plant from the top of this thing that I'm actually not supposed to climb to. And, yeah, and then I break my shoulder, whereas at the adventure playground, this is unusual. This is novel. I gotta be, before I become familiar, I gotta be a little more careful. So the litigation mitigation backfires completely there.
Absolutely. Backfires completely. Erin, this has been amazing, and you have to come back. We have to continue this conversation, but we really need to work together in Philadelphia. So you've got my email. So let's think about some way, plan, and who we should get to first. I always start small and then work my way up. So
well, there is an infrastructure, and I actually, just before we started talking, I looked at the Community Design Collaborative, which is an organization in Philly, was running a series. It is running a program, and I couldn't find the name of it. And I was even on an advisory a while ago, and I can't remember the name of it. I'm sure some of the people who are listening, maybe happily Megan might be. That some of the mechanisms are in place in my city, and I suspect in most cities there are those mechanisms of beginning to try to shake the policymakers into like, dude, this is really important.
Yeah, and so we need to pile on then, right? Yeah. So find that organization, and then we can work together on that, because it's this really exciting, just a really exciting conversation. I can't believe I haven't known about you. I did as soon as I saw the Police Statue Museum. I was like, oh my God. But my grandchildren went to the Police Statue Museum numerous times in their early childhood days, and they still go, can we go back to Alice in Wonderland? Sure. Yeah. So thank you so much, Erin.
Thank you very much.
Oh, it's truly been a pleasure. So to learn more about IPA-USA, or to see what other things that we do, because we do lots, please go to IPAUSA.org. Until next time, keep on playing.